Right. So I want to go ahead and thank you everyone for joining us this evening for this virtual presentation from the Museum of Medical History through the Sierra Sacramento Valley Medical Society. If you have any questions throughout the lecture, I just want to go ahead and point out the Q&A function in the lower part of your screen here. If you have a question, go ahead, pop it in there. We'll be reading them off at the end, and Dr. Carroll will answer them to the best of his abilities. I also want to remind everyone that the Museum of Medical History is open right now for reservations. I'm going to drop in an informational link here into the chat for everyone to see. And then with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to our longtime museum curator and local hero, I'm going to declare, Dr. Bob LaPerriere.
Thank you, Brandon. Thanks for that great introduction. The museum is open Tuesday and Thursday by appointment, and you can make the appointment by going to our website. We're hoping to get back to a 5-day-a-week schedule, hopefully in the near future, but I'm not sure when. But we're open Tuesday and Thursday. And one advantage of making the appointments is we try to have a docent available to guide people around and answer questions. I'm there almost every Tuesday. Tonight, I'd like to present Dr. Dylan Carroll, a history instructor at Butte College, and he's the author of Invisible Wounds, Mental Illness in Civil War Soldiers, which was published in November of last year. It also was a topic of a lecture he gave in the last year. And that lecture will be, in addition to tonight's, up on our website with a YouTube link. We also have 2 other lectures on the website. One is China to Sacramento, a 170-year journey, presented by Dr. Wesley Yee, a dentist whose heritage goes back to Fiddletown, to the herbalist there. And we also have one entitled Third World Medicine, presented by Dr. Scott Kellerman. And those both are available. And as I say, tonight's lecture and the last one by Dr. Carroll, hopefully soon, will also be up on the website. I'd like to thank Dr. Carroll also. He's helped us in the museum with some research and some work, and invite everyone to come see the museum if you've not seen it. And if you haven't seen it recently, come on back, because we're always making changes. Thank you for participating tonight, Dr. Carroll. Looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. This is my 3rd talk to the Museum of Medical History. And this one started sort of in the last talk where Dr. Bob, you had solicited topics people were interested in, and someone said alternative medicine. And I later contacted you and said, well, I could do that if you want. And you said, sure. So yeah, this is going to be about alternative medicine. Just to clarify, I am a doctor of philosophy and history. So I'm a historian, not a medical doctor. But part of my PhD training was in the history of medicine, which I got very interested in the history of medicine from a class, and then did a lot more graduate research on it. And I was particularly interested in alternative medicine, especially in the 19th century. And so when this topic came up as a possible topic for a lecture, I was well equipped to be able to tackle it. So let's begin. It's worth talking before we get into alternative medicine. It's worth talking about what medicine, regular, traditional, what's often called allopathic medicine look like. So what did regular traditional medicine look like? And that's worth jumping into before we look at alternative medicine. And even in the 19th century, regular traditional allopathic medicine was not too far from Hippocrates, pictured here. Hippocrates, of course, was famous for the Hippocratic oath that all doctors take, but more than that, Hippocrates was the ancient Greek philosopher or doctor. He may or may not have actually been one person. He may have been more than one people under the same name. But Hippocrates is famous for arguing disease and illness was not mystical or supernatural. Prior to Hippocrates, most people experience disease or illness as mystical or a punishment from the gods. Hippocrates is one of the first to say, no, disease is, instead of being mystical or supernatural, it was a result of natural observable phenomenon. And Hippocrates argued that disease or illness was the result of the imbalance of 4 fluids, or what he called humors. These were blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And any time one of these 4 major fluids got out of balance, Hippocrates argued, illness or disease resulted. And it sounds sort of, wacky and foolish to us. However, if we put ourselves into their shoes and their context, and realize they don't have X-ray, they don't have imaging technology, they don't have much of modern testing, and instead, they can't even look inside the body, and instead, all they can do is observe the body. And when you think about that, it makes a little bit of sense, because they would have viewed someone who was sick, who, for instance, had a symptom of vomiting. They were vomiting a lot all day. Well, someone like Hippocrates and many of his followers said, hey, the body is trying to get this yellow bile out. There's something's out of balance here. There's too much yellow bile, and they're just trying to get it out. And so if we put ourselves in the context in their shoes, it kind of makes a little bit of sense, despite being a bit wacky to us. Hippocrates' ideas and theories were developed further by Galen. The Roman physician Claudius Galenus started his career as a doctor to gladiators and ended it as the court physician to the Roman emperor. And he was famous for enlarging Hippocrates' ideas, one of which was Galen argued that there were predispositions, that some people were predisposed or had certain temperaments, like a melancholic disposition made someone more predisposed to depression. A choleric disposition made someone more predisposed to anger or outbursts of violence. Galen also expanded the treatment protocols. In addition to depletive treatments such as bleeding and purging, Galen added more cooling and drying treatment protocols to Hippocratic theories of disease and illness. This amazingly is still in the 19th century how many doctors viewed disease largely. So not a ton had changed in really several thousand years. There was a couple new theories in vogue on the landscape of American medicine by the 19th century. One was what's known as Miasma Theory. So in addition to kind of Hippocratic theories of ideas of the balance of fluids, by the 19th century, American doctors believed that poisonous gases or vapors could result in disease or illness. These were known as miasmas, these poisonous gas clouds or vapor clouds. And again, it sounds, sort of wacky to us, but if we put ourselves into the context of the time, it makes a bit of sense in that at the time, 19th century cities were growing tremendously. They're becoming very crowded, and many of them have little to no sewage systems. And so if you took a time machine back to a 19th century city like New York or Philadelphia or, God forbid, Cincinnati, you would be assaulted by the horrid smells of horse dung, latrines, rotting offal, and even rotting animals. And there was so much sickness in these crowded American cities that naturally American doctors blamed it on the smells, saying, look, these cities stink something awful to high heaven. Obviously, this is causing disease. We can see, this idea and the remedies for it in newspapers of the time. So this is from the Daily Mississippian in 1863, a newspaper with an article titled "Cleanse the Backyards." And it warns readers, quote, "The warm season is upon us. The time for malarious exhalations is approaching. The most malignant types of fevers are often produced from the foul and noxious effluvia arising from offensive localities near a dwelling. Let us remove the hurtful cause. A little labor, a little time, a little attention and care will clear away the plague miasma, and we shall inhale pure air and escape the pain, the anxiety of the sick room, and maybe the mournful incidents of the deathbed." So miasma was really the only new theory of disease or illness that had emerged by the 19th century. Treatments had changed a little bit. And this was what's known as heroic therapy. Heroic therapy emerges in the 1790s in the wake of an incredibly deadly 1793 yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia. Cities like Philadelphia had regular yellow fever epidemics. The 1793 epidemic is particularly bad. And Dr. Benjamin Rush, a Philadelphia luminary, signer of the Declaration, is in Philadelphia for virtually the entire epidemic, ministering to the sick and dying of yellow fever. And it's during this epidemic that he develops what's known as heroic therapy. Heroic therapy was essentially aggressive, what you might call heroic bleeding and purging. So there wasn't much difference in the therapy, except it was just much more aggressive and interventionist. Dr. Rush remembered after the epidemic, writing, quote, "I preferred frequent and small to large bleedings in the beginning of September, but toward the height and close of the epidemic, I saw no inconvenience from the loss of a pint and even 20 ounces of blood at a time. I drew from many persons 70 and 80 ounces in 5 days, and from a few a much larger quantity. Never before did I experience such a sublime joy as I now felt in contemplating the success of my remedies." The idea behind this was that Americans were a uniquely heroic and hardy people, and they required heroic and hardy medical interventions for their diseases and illnesses. So it's kind of you might say, a medical theory of American exceptionalism. And so by the early to mid 19th century, heroic therapy is in vogue, this aggressive bleeding and purging treatment protocol. And nothing purges quite like calomel, which becomes a favorite prescription by traditional physicians. Calomel is a mercury compound. Yes, mercury, so it was toxic. When taken, it causes volcanic diarrhea and vomiting, which is exactly what doctors wanted in the 19th century, using these depletive therapies to treat illness and disease. And physicians believed that, calomel was a great drug that would flush the system of morbid material. And it was one of the favorite prescribing drugs of American doctors in the early to mid 19th century. Amazingly, by the 1830s, many Americans began to revolt against the allopathic tradition of heroic therapy. Many Americans began to grow frustrated with this depletive therapy of bleeding and purging. They wanted something easier. They wanted something that relied more extensively, perhaps, on nature. And to meet that growing demand and that growing frustration with traditional medical practices and intervention, alternative medicines rose to meet the moment, and they became incredibly popular in the early to mid 19th century. We're going to talk about a few of them, starting with arguably the most popular Thomsonianism. Thomsonianism is named after this guy. Samuel Thomson was the founder of Thomsonianism. Thomson was born in the howling wilderness of backwoods, New Hampshire. He grew up in nature and claimed that from a young age he was helping the family cattle business, but watching over cattle was boring to him. And so to relieve his boredom, Thomson threw himself into studying plants and botany and herbal pharmacy. On one of these excursions, according to his biography, he discovered, experimented with lobelia, his favorite and later famous, what he called, quote, emetic herb. Lobelia is toxic, causing perspiration and vomiting. And apparently Thomson discovered this himself and then began to, quote unquote, experiment with it. And one of the people he experimented with it on was a coworker. One day, according to Thomson's biography, he was working and decided as a practical joke, he would dose a fellow coworker with lobelia. He remembered, quote, "The man broke out in a most profuse perspiration, trembled very much, and laid down on the ground and vomited several times." Great coworker, Samuel Thomson, right? But that man who Thomson had dosed with lobelia was later carried to a house. He then ate a hearty meal and went back to work. And he later declared that he felt better than he ever had in his life. And this convinced Thomson that lobelia had tremendous health effects. And so lobelia became the favorite herbal remedy of what increasingly became known as Thomsonianism, this alternative medicine. Thomson himself, was never shy of praising lobelia, writing that lobelia cleansed the stomach, overpowers the cold, and promoted a free perspiration. It had an almost unlimited extent of friendly power, truly prepared to deal death blows to the Hydra disease. And Samuel Thomson theorized that fever was the product of a disease, unlike traditional physicians, allopathic doctors who argued that fever was a byproduct of disease. Thomson theorized that fever was the body trying to fight off a disease, resisting the chill of a cold. And he believed that anything that would heat the body, that would assist in the creation of heat to fight off a cold, was good. Lobelia was his favorite herbal remedy to do that, to cause heat, to do what he called sweep the human fireplace clean and equip it to burn undampened. Lobelia wasn't the only drug that Thomsonians liked to prescribe. One of their other favorite prescriptions was cayenne pepper. They also used marsh rosemary, witch hazel, poplar bark, golden seal, peach, and cherry. What made Thomsonianism so popular in the 19th century was Samuel Thomson's marketing. Thomson, was a gifted marketer. And he, in 1813, patented his system of herbal medicine, and then essentially established a pyramid scheme with Thomson at the top, who would then sell to licensed agents the right to sell his botanical medicines. Those agents would then sell those kits to customers for $20. Thomson got a cut of it all. And this became incredibly popular. In 1839, Thomson estimated that 100,000 rights had been sold, and he estimated that 3 million Americans had adopted his system. The population at the time was 17 million. And so if Thompson's estimation was correct, that meant nearly 20% of the country were Thomsonians or dabbling in Thomsonianism. That was almost assuredly an exaggeration, but nonetheless, Thomsonianism was incredibly popular. Now, $20 is a lot for 19th century Americans, and so you might be wondering why. But the pitch of Thomsonianism was that, yes, you paid a steep price up front of $20, but then presumably you would never need a doctor again. And the pitch of Thomsonianism, used by Samuel Thompson and his many licensed agents, was every man his own physician. It was an effort to democratize medicine, to make medicine accessible for the average American. And many of Thompson's licensed agents repeated these ideas. One Vermont Thomsonian agent urged his customers to become their own doctors, saying, quote, "To the farmer, the mechanic, and the non-professional reader in general, it has been taught and believed that common people, nature's real nobility, have not a proper right to study medicine. That is utterly false. Would you be slaves? No. Arouse then to your sense of reason and humanity and take charge of your own bodies. Your abilities are equal, yea, better for the task than the faculty. Yourselves do know that rejecting the physician has sometimes saved life and limb. We know it has hundreds. Be your own physicians. No one can supply your place. It will not only save your lives, but your money." What were Thompson's motivations for this practice? Well, as we'll see, like other alternative medicine practitioners, this was personal. In 1790, Samuel Thompson's mother had become ill, diagnosed with, quote, "galloping consumption," and her doctors treated her with mercury and opium. She died 9 weeks later. And Thompson blamed her doctors for her death, writing, quote, "They galloped her out of the world in about 9 weeks." And every chance he got, Thompson unleashed a torrent of vitriolic hatred on doctors. He was particularly critical of traditional doctors' elitism, such as their use of medical jargon, writing, quote, They have learned just enough to know how to deceive the people and keep them in ignorance by covering their doings under an unknown language to their patients, and keep the world ignorant of their doings, that they may better impose upon the credulity of the people." Traditional allopathic doctors fought back, and a bitter medical fight ensued between traditional allopathic physicians and Thomsonians. Allopathic physicians, traditional doctors, fought back with words, with writing, and with the occasional lawsuit. One such allopathic physician wrote about Thomsonians, quote, "Thomsonianism was the most stupendous system of quackery and the most insulting offering ever tendered to the understanding of a free and enlightened people. What a perfect relief it brings to all the uncertainty of medicine. Away then with all careworn experience and all study. Keep up a constant fire of lobelia, red pepper, and steen, and you will certainly kill the disease at least if you do not kill the patient." And traditional doctors, allopaths, occasionally tried to have Thompson and some of his followers brought up on charges of manslaughter after a patient died. The majority of these cases ended in acquittal, and the one Thomsonian doctor who was guilty of manslaughter, that guilt was later overthrown by an appeals court. So as far as I know, no Thomsonian doctor was ever successfully brought up on manslaughter charges for treating a patient. Thomsonianism began a decline, and that decline became a free fall in 1843 when Samuel Thomson died. Thomson became ill and for 2 weeks dosed himself with lobelia and cayenne pepper and steam, but nothing could prevent his demise, and he died. And nothing is worse for someone with a cure-all than the inventor of that cure-all dying. And so Thomsonianism went into decline, but not completely, because several offshoots and sects who broke off from Thomsonianism continued some of the major ideas. One of those is physiomedicalism. In 1838, Alva Curtis, pictured here, withdrew from the Thomsonian fold and established an independent botanical practice, which eventually became known as physiomedicalism. If you'll notice, Alva Curtis has a neck beard at a time when that was popular in the 19th century. Who knows what they were thinking? Physiomedicalism was essentially Thomsonianism, but with schools. Physiomedicalists were herbal doctors. They used things like lobelia. They used much of the Thomsonian herbal practice, but they believed every man his own physician was a mistake, and instead they created schools to train their practitioners. Alva Curtis himself criticized Thomsonianism, writing, quote, "The miraculous power of transforming farmers and mechanics into doctors in a moment is doubted in the present day." After the Civil War, there were a dozen physiomedical schools in the United States. The last physiomedical school closed its doors in 1911, so it was surprisingly long-lasting. Another offshoot of Thomsonianism were the eclectics. Eclectics essentially borrowed from all schools of practice, using anything that experience showed to be safe and effective. And this is summarized in one of their main ideas, which was, quote, "use anything that works." Eclectics used Thomsonian remedies. They used Native American remedies. They used non-mineral drugs from traditional allopathic doctors. They used anything that was non-depletive, that didn't result in purging. As such, they rejected both calomel and lobelia as depletive, purging drugs. And instead, used anything that was non-depletive and worked. Eclectics, like physiomedicalists, also established schools. The last eclectic school closed in 1939 in Cincinnati. So like physiomedicalism, eclectic schools were surprisingly long-lasting. That closes the books on Thomsonianism and brings us to our next alternative medicine practice, which was founded by this guy and was known as homeopathy. Homeopathy was founded by German physician Samuel Hahnemann. Hahnemann was a trained doctor. He received his MD at Erlangen in 1779. But once he began practicing, Samuel Hahnemann was dispirited and depressed by the health outcomes of his patients and despaired of his medical training. He remembered, quote, "I sank into a state of sorrowful indignation. The weakness and errors of my teachers and books, founded upon perhapses and blind chance." And in the wake of his dispiriting depression, Hahnemann went on to develop homeopathy, this new alternative medicine practice. Its name comes from the Greek homoios, which means like, and pathos, which means suffering. And its name gives us a clue for one of its main theories, which was called the laws of similars. Homeopaths, like Hahnemann, believed that drugs that produced similar symptoms of a disease would cure that disease. And they called this the laws of similars. Drugs that produce similar symptoms of a disease would cure that disease. You might ask, how do they know drugs produce similar symptoms to the symptoms of a disease? It's a great question if you were asking that to yourself. The answer is they experimented. Homeopaths conducted experiments, which they called provings, to test what effects different remedies would have on patients. Now, these were experiments in the loosest sense of the word. For instance, there were no control subjects for these experiments. And some of these effects of provings were quite interesting. One homeopath wrote different symptoms of drugs. The symptoms included, I'm going to read a few of them here. Some symptoms included, quote, yawning and stretching, easily falls asleep when reading, weakness of memory, excessive liability to become pregnant, rage, at the time the menses made their appearance, voluptuous itching of the penis when walking in the open air, excessive trembling of the whole body when dallying with females, heartburn, flatulence, bad breath, end quote. So who knows if any of these drugs proved caused any of these symptoms. I guess, if you want to make an excuse when the next time you have flatulence or bad breath, you can tell your significant other that it's the result of a homeopathic proving. That will get a puzzled look. Trust me, I know, because I've done it. In addition to provings or experiments, a major theory of homeopathy was drug dilution. Samuel Hahnemann believed that the ordinary doses of drugs were causing dangerous symptoms, and instead he believed that diluted drugs would be more beneficial. Hahnemann would eventually settled on 1 grain of drug that would be mixed with 99 grains of lactose or milk sugar. Sometimes drugs could be so diluted, it was questionable whether the solution contained any drug at all. Nonetheless, Abraham Lincoln joked, as he joked about many things, joked about the homeopaths, saying, quote, homeopaths made their medicine from the shadow of a starved pigeon's wing, end quote. That's a joke only Lincoln could make. Finally, Hahnemann's homeopathic theory surmised that the health of the body depended on a vital force that was dynamic and spiritual. He believed essentially his practice healed at the spiritual level. He could not explain how this happened, and he frankly did not care to explain. He didn't think an explanation was warranted or mattered. He wrote, quote, I place but a slight value upon an attempt at explanation. It has been verified to the world by every pure experiment and genuine experience. A scientific explanation of its mode of action is of little importance. Essentially saying, I know it's worked. I don't need to explain it to you. Just accept it. Like Thomsonianism, a bitter war of words ensued between regular allopathic physicians and homeopathic physicians like Samuel Hahnemann. Hahnemann took a position at a hospital in Leipzig and offered lectures on homeopathy, where he, in addition to talking about his homeopathic theories, heaped abuse on regular allopathic doctors. Students of his remembered him as, quote, a raging hurricane, as he poured forth a flood of abuse against the older medicine. And regular traditional doctors responded in kind. One doctor heaped abuse on homeopathy and Hahnemann, writing, quote, we challenge all mankind to name another instance where a man has asserted similar nonsense and has not been considered fully entitled to a place in the lunatic asylum. In 1829, Hahnemann's wife died, and he became sort of a reclusive hermit for a time, retreating from public life, maybe a bit bruised from these bitter medical fights, until a 35-year-old French woman sought out the reclusive Hahnemann and swept the 80-year-old doctor off his feet and whisked him to Paris to become her groom and brought him back to public life. And it was this that brought him to the attention of Hans Graham, an American, a Bostonian who was studying medicine, but like Hahnemann was frustrated at medicine's limits and became attracted to homeopathy. And it was Hans Graham that brought homeopathy to America. By the 1830s, Philadelphia became the epicenter of American homeopathy. And by 1860, an estimated 2,000 American doctors practiced homeopathy. It's estimated that in the 19th century, as many as 5% of all doctors might have been homeopaths. So they were quite popular, a quite popular alternative medicine branch at the time. And that brings us to our final look at an alternative medicine practice in the 19th century. That is hydropathy. Hydropathy, like homeopathy, was founded not by an American, but a European. In this case, hydropathy was founded by Vincent Priesnitz, an Austrian farm boy, who became convinced that exposure to cold water had curative powers. Vincent had self-treated himself with cold water baths, and he'd also experimented on animals and family members, and became increasingly convinced of the curative powers of cold water. And hydropathy was essentially the belief in the curing powers of water and hydration. Vincent eventually opened a hydropathy school in Grafenberg, and hydropathy very quickly became in vogue in the United States, particularly in the Northeast, where hydropathy schools were open in places like New York State. The theory for hydropathy was pretty simple. Patients needed to be wet inside and out for extended periods of time, and that would result in better health and perhaps even cures for any ailments they were suffering. To do this, they would undergo a variety of therapies. Patients would take cold water plunges, they would take cold water baths, they would be wrapped in wet sheets, sometimes forced to walk for some time wrapped in wet sheets, other times forced to lay down in beds, tightly wrapped in wet sheets, and they would also be forced to drink frequent tumblers of cold water, as much as they could stomach. This is a couple contemporary windows into hydropathy therapies. So you can see on the top left, a patient taking a cold water bath. To the top right, you can see a patient with his head in cold water. On the middle left, you can see a patient sitting in cold water. And on the middle right, you can see a patient being subjected to a cold water shower, which was essentially a pipe that piped out cold water. And on the bottom left, you can see a patient walking wrapped in cold sheets. And on the bottom right, you can see a patient in bed wrapped in wet sheets being poured a tumbler of water. Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain allegedly either experienced hydropathy or heard about it when he joked about it, writing, quote, "I perspired so much that mother put a life preserver to bed with me." While another patient of hydropathy noted, quote, "It is indeed no child's play to have such a torrent of liquid ice pouring down in a stream of Arctic temperature upon your tender epidermis." What was the appeal of some of these non-traditional alternative medicine practices? Why were people drawn to some of these therapies? Well, the answer is complicated, and there's probably a variety of reasons that people were drawn to Thomsonianism or homeopathy or hydropathy or others, and there were others. One was many of these were cheaper than treatment from a regular traditional doctor, and affordability was a major draw of alternative medicine, especially homeopathy. Homeopathy was the cheapest of the alternative medicines, and perhaps explains more than the others its popularity simply because it was more affordable. Thomsonianism required expensive overhead. You had to pay that $20, but the pitch behind it was once you paid that $20, you'd never need a doctor again. Of course, that likely wasn't true. But that was their pitch. Another reason for the appeal of alternative medicine was, as I alluded to at the beginning, there was deep frustration with traditional medical practice at the time, specifically with depletive practices such as bleeding and purging. Simply put, Americans had grown tired and frustrated with heroic therapy. They'd grown tired and frustrated with bleeding and purging. Calomel was a special source of hatred for many Americans. This, mercurial compound. One Thomsonian doctor characterized calomel as, quote, "the Samson of the materia medica, not a cure-all, but a kill-all, the bane of life. Resolve you will not be calomelized anymore by the mineral faculty." Other Americans came to alternative medicine like Thomsonianism, like homeopathy, out of desperation. Traditional regular doctors might have failed them, and they came to alternative medicines desperate for some sort of therapy or cure. This was the case, tragically, with one Virginia man who noted that he came to a Thomsonian, quote, "The death of 7 out of 11 of my family under the treatment of regular physicians induced me to call a Thomsonian to attend the 8th. So tragically, someone like this Virginia man came to alternative medicine practitioners out of desperation. Nothing had worked. They were desperate for something to work, desperate for some sort of treatment or cure. Additionally, alternative medicine, and again, specifically homeopathy, was much easier for children. Especially homeopathy with its diluted lactose pills were much easier for children to take and absorb. One parent celebrated about homeopathy, quote, "We no longer need to promise pieces of money or cookies to get the child to drink the nasty dose." And finally, during this period of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, there was a growing and deep anti-intellectualism and anti-establishment feeling in American society and culture. This was a feature of what historians call the Jacksonian era, this period from the 1820s to 1840s. And I think it's worth exploring a little bit more how alternative medicine thrived in the Jacksonian era of deep anti-intellectual and anti-establishment feeling in American society and culture. As you might have guessed, the Jacksonian era is named after Andrew Jackson. Jackson was orphaned by the American Revolution. He was sort of a true self-made man. He moved to Tennessee, where he became a lawyer and later a slave-holding planter. In the 1790s, Jackson joined Congress first as a representative in the House and then as a senator. But Jackson became a bona fide celebrity in the wake of the War of 1812, where he slaughtered hundreds of Creek Native Americans at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and then defeated the British resoundingly at the Battle of New Orleans. Really the only victory for the Americans in the War of 1812, which otherwise was a pretty miserable war for the Americans. This victory at New Orleans made Andrew Jackson a true American celebrity. And in the 1820s, Jackson set his eyes on the White House. Jackson was considered a buffoonish, dangerous candidate by much of the Washington establishment. Much of the Washington elite considered him unfit, dangerous, and buffoonish for the White House. In the 1824 election, for instance, none other than founding father Thomas Jefferson denounced Andrew Jackson for president, saying, quote, "I feel much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson as president. He is one of the most unfit men I know of for such a place. He has had very little respect for laws and constitutions. His passions are terrible. When I was president, he was senator, and he could never speak on account of the rashness of his feelings. I have seen him attempt it repeatedly and as often choke with rage. His passions are no doubt cooler now. He has been much tried since I knew him, but he is a dangerous man." Jackson would lose that race in 1824. Thomas Jefferson died the next year. And in 1828, Jackson ran again, where he was still considered a dangerous candidate by many Americans. His supporters, such as John Eaton, pictured here, pitched Jackson as an outsider who could clean up Washington, D.C., making this perhaps the first Drain the Swamp campaign, if you will. Eaton wrote, quote, "Look to the city of Washington and let the virtuous patriots of the country weep at the spectacle. There corruption is springing into existence and fast flourishing." And according to Eaton, Jackson was the man to clean up Washington. Once Jackson became president, he set about essentially revolting against national elites. He flouted the status quo. He battled institutions that opposed him or that he disliked. For instance, Jackson destroyed the National Bank, the nation's first and at the time only major financial institution. Against the will of the Supreme Court, Jackson forcibly removed the Cherokee Native Americans from the Southeast to modern-day Oklahoma. Thousands died in the process. And when alternative medicine practitioners like Thompsonians and homeopaths complained about state licensing laws, Jackson and his supporters were receptive. At the time, state licensing laws only allowed regular traditional allopathic physicians to be licensed doctors. Thompsonians and homeopaths and others complained about this, complaining that it was unfair, that it was elitism of traditional doctors to deny them state licensing. Jackson and his supporters were receptive and set about dismantling state licensing laws. By 1850, only 2 states had licensing laws remaining. Every other state that had licensing laws before then had them repealed. One Jackson ally in New York, in a speech when New York repealed its licensing laws, said, quote, "Mankind should be left to judge for themselves who treats them best, and not have absurdities forced upon them, merely because they are dictated by men who have got diplomas, earned principally by fees, and some years' attendance on absurd and insipid lectures at medical rooms." Many traditional allopathic doctors lamented these license repeals. One sadly lamented, quote, "Anyone, male or female, learned or ignorant, an honest man or a knave, can assume the name of a physician and practice upon anyone, to cure or to kill, as either may happen without accountability." In closing, I think it's worth thinking about if there were any benefits of alternative medicine at the time. And I think that there were. While the theory of alternative medicine at the time was sometimes wacky, especially homeopathy, their treatments were oftentimes less invasive, less depletive, and ultimately less dangerous than the traditional methods of bleeding and purging. And the benefits of this extended beyond alternative medicine. While most traditional doctors were intensely critical of alternative healers, there were some who learned from alternative doctors to trust the healing power of nature more than to turn instinctively to depletive remedies such as bleeding and purging. One such doctor, while criticizing homeopathy and Samuel Hahnemann, noted this, writing, quote, "The whole scheme is frail as a spider's web and must fall to atoms and be blown away by the wind." Yet after all, perhaps Hahnemann did not live wholly in vain. Through the use of his empty and inert means, we have been enabled to see what the innate powers of the animal organization can accomplish without medical interference. We have been taught to rely more upon these and less upon art, and have seen the wonderful influence which the mind has over the bodily functions. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Carol. As everyone might be able to see down at the bottom of your screen, you've got the Q&A function available. Go ahead and pop your questions in there or into the chat feature, and we'll go ahead and get answering those. I'd also like to remind everyone that if you're interested in touring the museum, it is open to the public now, and we have tours available. I'll go ahead and drop those back in the chat again. We currently don't have any questions waiting for you, but if we want to give people a moment to drop one on in there, that would be great if you've got anything you want to ask Dr. Carroll.
Maybe a brief comment while we're waiting.
Yeah.
We had a hydropath in Sacramento in the 1800s. Pretty much the office was near the Railroad Museum. And interestingly enough, her name was Dr. Levina Waterhouse.
Right on. A hydropath named Waterhouse in the River City.
I saw that one participant had raised their hand, but it looks like they've lowered it since then. But we have a question here from Catherine Stewart. Is Hahnemann the same one for whom the medical school is named?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to off the top of my head. My apologies.
All right. From David Stewart, we've got, was utilization of indigenous traditional treatments common?
It depended on where you were. The short answer is no. But it depended on where you were. And what I mean by that is on the frontier, you would see traditional indigenous treatment methods being more common. Because on the frontier, many Americans had more interaction with Native Americans than they did in, say, cities like Philadelphia or New York or Boston. And so you'd see it more on the frontier, but generally no. And that came from sort of the, you might say, bloated self-confidence of Americans' ideas of exceptionalism. They believed that they were, at the time in the 19th century, they believed they were the more enlightened, more civilized people. And in fact, they believed that the Native Americans were on the way to extinction, and that there weren't going to be very many Native Americans anymore for long. And so because of that, they didn't believe that Native American health practices had really any benefit, when in fact, they of course did. The Native Americans were, for instance, had much better, what's the right word I'm looking for? Much better sort of health practices. They would bathe frequently, almost every day. Native Americans would often floss their teeth with, blades of grass or things like that. So they were much more hygienic. That's the word I'm looking for. They were a bit more hygienic than Americans at the time, which may have resulted in better health. Of course, we don't know because we can't effectively measure health outcomes in the 19th century because nobody was keeping track of Native American health outcomes effectively.
I feel comfortable saying today that better hygiene equals better health. We have an anonymous question here. Did slave medicine practices have an impact? It seems like a lot of these alternative practices were based on herbalism.
Yeah, great question. Slave medicine practice was often, among much of enslaved culture at the time was built on resistance. Many African-American slaves at the time distrusted doctors. They distrusted doctors because they viewed doctors as the agents of the slaveholders, which in most cases they were. Doctors serving enslaved populations were not all necessarily interested in the health of the slaves. They were more interested in the wealth of the slaveholder and ensuring that they had healthy and virile slave stock. Slaves were aware of that. And so they were distrustful of doctors and tried to resist medical interventions as much as they could. And many of them relied more on traditional medicinal practices. They relied on herbal remedies. They relied on some, supernatural elements. Frederick Douglass in his memoir recalls, I think, putting a root under his bed at one point when he was sick or ill, and that was a traditional kind of mystical medicinal practice. So a lot of it was in opposition to traditional medicine, ironically similar to alternative medicine, which grew up in opposition to traditional medicine.
All right, now looks like we got time for one last question here, and that is, do you have any recommended books on quackery?
Yeah, so one of the books that I like a lot on this and that I've relied a lot for this presentation is by James Wharton. It's called Nature Cures: The History of Alternative Medicine in America. It was published in 2002 by Oxford University Press. And that title again was Nature Cures: The History of Alternative Medicine in America. I also really like, I can find it. The Martin Kaufman's book called Homeopathy in America: The Rise and Fall of a Medical Heresy, published in 1971 by Johns Hopkins Press. So that was by Martin Kaufman, Homeopathy in America. And I also there's a good article by Ronald Numbers called Do It Yourself the Sectarian Way. And it's from an edited collection called Medicine Without Doctors, Home Healthcare in American History, published in 1977 by Science History Publications. So those are a couple books that I relied on for this presentation and then that I recommend.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Carroll, for your time and your thoughts and presentation with us. And thank you, Dr. LaPerriere, for hosting us this evening. And I want to thank everyone for joining us and spending your evening with us. For those who are wondering, we will have this recording placed online for you to view at a later date if you want to watch it again, if there was something interesting that you want to catch again, or if you want to recommend it to a friend or colleague. Are there any closing thoughts from either Dr. Carroll or Dr. LaPerriere?
I'd just like to thank Dr. Carroll again for a really outstanding lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. I always love to bloviate about the history of medicine whenever given the opportunity.